You really think you can still make that shot, old man? Lance Corporal Ethan Moore's voice sliced through the air, dripping with arrogance as he watched the old man approach the firing line. The wind howled across the barren field, pushing his words toward the veteran like an invisible challenge. James Hawk Cooper didn't flinch. He didn't respond. His eyes, a piercing shade of pale blue, were fixed on the distant target, 2,000 yards away, as if it was already in his sights. The young recruits gathered around him, 5 in total, stood with their arms crossed, some smirking, others whispering among themselves. Ethan, the most vocal of the group, couldn't hold back the mocking tone in his voice. "Come on, Hawk. What are you gonna do with that old relic?" His laugh echoed in the wind, but James didn't even acknowledge it. His hands were steady, despite his age. He had seen this before, young men eager to prove themselves, eager to belittle someone they thought was past his prime. Ethan's voice rang out again, louder this time. "I bet you couldn't hit that target even if your life depended on it. You're a dinosaur, a relic from a bygone war. Let's see what you've got, old man." The others, Private Olivia Price, Private Jacob Lewis, Private Mia Clark, and Private Logan Hall, glanced at each other, unsure whether to laugh or to just watch. They had heard stories of James Hawk Cooper, a man who had once been a legend. But stories were just stories, and they were skeptical. After all, this wasn't the battlefield, this was just a routine training exercise. James didn't care about their skepticism. His life had been a long string of challenges, each one more dangerous than the last. He had never been a man of many words, especially not now. He adjusted his position, checking his sniper rifle, an old, worn-out model that had seen countless missions, countless wars. The young recruit still didn't understand. They had their state-of-the-art gear, their modern rifles, their advanced scopes. They thought they were the best, that their fancy technology could solve any problem. But James knew better. He had learned the hard way that the mind, the focus, and the experience were worth far more than any gadget. His fingers tightened around the trigger. The recruits continued to watch, their whispers and laughter fading into the background. James took a deep breath, steadying himself. The wind howled again, but he had already calculated it, he had already factored it all in. He exhaled slowly, aligned his shot, and pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot was like a whisper in the wind, almost imperceptible. The moment the bullet left the barrel, the world seemed to slow down. The recruits held their breath, eyes wide as they followed the flight of the bullet. Then, a moment later, the target exploded, the metal silhouette crumpling under the force of the shot. Ethan's jaw dropped. The others stood frozen, unable to comprehend what had just happened. James lowered his rifle slowly, his expression unchanged. The recruits remained silent, their cocky confidence replaced by awe. Ethan's voice finally broke the silence, but this time it was different. "How did you?" he asked, his words barely above a whisper. James turned his gaze to him, his eyes calm, steady. "Experience," he said simply, his voice carrying the weight of a lifetime of battles. Ethan, and the rest of the recruits, stood there, speechless, realizing that they had just witnessed something extraordinary, something that no amount of modern technology could replicate. The silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the soft rustle of the wind across the dusty field. The recruits stood frozen, their eyes still wide from what they had just witnessed. Ethan Moore, the loudest among them, swallowed hard, unable to process what had just happened. James Hawk Cooper didn't say a word. He simply lowered his rifle and stood up straight, his posture impeccable, a quiet authority radiating from him. His gaze drifted over the recruits, his eyes briefly meeting Ethan's. There was no mockery, no triumph in his expression, just calm, steady resolve. The wind continued to whistle around them, but for the first time, the recruits were silent. The target was now a twisted mess of metal, barely recognizable. Ethan had expected failure, expected a frail old man to miss, maybe even struggle with the weight of his rifle. Instead, he had just witnessed a master at work, and he couldn't deny the shock running through him. How did you do that?" Ethan finally asked, his voice quieter now, almost reverent. James didn't respond right away. His gaze flickered back to the target, then to the sky above, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. Experience, he said, his voice low but carrying a weight that the others could feel in their bones. The recruits exchanged glances. Olivia, the quietest of the group, stepped forward, her curiosity overtaking her. Experience? That's all you're going to say, she asked. You just hit a target that none of us could even imagine. What's your secret? James turned to her, his gaze steady, but this time there was a flicker of something, maybe recognition, maybe just the weight of the years he'd lived. There's no secret, he said. Just years of paying attention. You learn to listen to the wind, to read the world around you. And sometimes, you learn when to pull the trigger and when to wait. Ethan took a step forward, still processing. So, what? You think we could learn that too? James turned his gaze back to the horizon. The sun was setting now, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. You can, he said, his voice quieter. But it takes time. A lot of time. And you have to want it more than anything else. You'll never understand the true power of patience until you've seen it in the heat of battle. And even then, you'll never truly be ready for it. The recruit stood there, their skepticism slowly melting away. They were all too aware now of what they had just witnessed, not just an old man hitting a target, but a reminder of everything they had yet to learn. James Hawk Cooper, the old man who had lived through wars they could only read about, had just shown them what true skill and experience looked like. The wind picked up again, and the sun continued to dip lower, casting long shadows across the field. But in that moment, nothing felt more real than the lessons the recruits had just begun to understand. The sun had nearly set by the time James Hawk Cooper and the recruits gathered their gear. The day had turned, and with it, something had shifted in the air. The cocky banter and laughter of the recruits had fallen silent, replaced by the steady rhythm of boots on the gravel. Ethan Moore, who had once been the loudest, now walked alongside James, his shoulders slightly hunched, his gaze directed at the ground. Olivia Price, always the quiet one, seemed to be deep in thought as she watched the fading light. She was the first to break the silence. What made you keep going all these years? She asked, her voice hesitant but genuine. James didn't look at her right away. His hands moved over his gear with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times. I kept going because the world doesn't stop, he said finally, his voice steady. You can either keep up, or you get left behind. The words hung in the air, but the recruits didn't know how to respond. It was clear to them that James had lived a life they couldn't yet fathom. Ethan looked up, a question bubbling in his mind. How do you deal with it? The quiet, he asked, unsure how to phrase it. James turned his head slightly, his eyes narrowing ever so slightly. The quiet can be louder than anything else, he said. It's in the moments when everything slows down, and you're left with just yourself and the weight of what you've seen. That's when you learn who you really are. They walked in silence for a few more moments, the only sounds being the crunch of their boots on the gravel and the soft rustle of the wind. The setting sun cast long shadows across the field, and as they neared the end of the training area, James stopped. You've learned something today, he said, his voice soft but firm. But don't think that this one shot means you're ready. It's just a start. Ethan opened his mouth to speak but closed it again. He had so many questions, but now didn't seem like the time. Instead, he simply nodded. I think we understand, Olivia said quietly, looking up at James. It's not about the shot. It's about learning when to take it. James gave a small nod, a faint smile crossing his face for the first time all day. Exactly, he said, turning toward the group. But more importantly, it's about knowing when to wait. That's what separates a soldier from a machine. The patience to wait, and the wisdom to act when the time comes. The recruit stood there, absorbing his words. It was clear they had been given something far more valuable than just a lesson in shooting. They had been shown a glimpse of the kind of wisdom that only comes from experience, something that couldn't be taught in a classroom or drilled into you. On the range. It was something that could only be earned through time, through surviving battles both on the field and within yourself. As they gathered their things and began to head back, there was a shift in their demeanor. The bravado, the arrogance, the doubt, all of it was gone. In its place was something different, respect. And for the first time that day, Ethan more truly understood what it meant to be a veteran. The next morning, the recruits arrived early at the training grounds, their faces still carrying the weight of the previous day's lesson. They moved with purpose now, their chatter hushed, their steps measured. James Hawk Cooper was already there, standing by the edge of the field, his silhouette framed by the rising sun. The early light caught the sharp lines of his face, his expression as unreadable as ever. Ethan Moore was the first to approach, his usual bravado gone, replaced by a quiet respect. "Morning, sir," he said, his voice softer than it had been the day before. James turned his gaze toward him, a faint nod acknowledging his presence. "Morning," he replied, his tone as steady as the man himself. "Ready to learn some more?" Ethan hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "I think so," he said, his voice carrying a hint of determination. "You said yesterday that patience was key. But how do you know when to act?" James looked out across the field, his eyes narrowing slightly as if considering the question carefully. "You don't always know," he said slowly. "Sometimes, you just have to trust yourself. The key is knowing that when the moment comes, you have to be ready. That's what separates those who survive from those who don't." Olivia Price, Jacob Lewis, Mia Clark, and Logan Hall had gathered around now, their attention focused on James. They had all felt the shift in their mindset, the change in how they saw the world and their training. Olivia stepped forward. "So it's not just about the shot, right?" she asked. "It's about the timing." James met her gaze. "Exactly," he said. "It's about more than just being fast or accurate. It's about being in the right place at the right time, and knowing when to make your move." The recruit stood in silence, processing his words. They had thought it was all about speed, about being the first to act. But now, they understood that there was a different kind of power, one that came with time, experience, and the ability to wait. "How do you even begin to teach that?" Logan asked. "How do you teach someone to wait?" James didn't immediately respond. He turned to face the field once more, his gaze distant, as if lost in a memory. "You don't," he said finally. "You can't teach patience. You can only learn it by surviving, by being in situations where you had no choice but to wait. And when the time comes, you'll know. You'll feel it." The recruits nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. They had come to realize that the skills they were learning here weren't just about physical strength or technical ability. They were about mental endurance, about understanding that not every challenge could be faced head-on. Sometimes, the best move was to wait and watch, to observe, and then, when the moment was right, to act decisively. The air around them was still, the sounds of the bass in the distance fading into the background as they stood there, united in the understanding that their training was far from over. James looked at each of them in turn, his gaze lingering on Ethan. "You've all learned something valuable here," he said. "But this is just the beginning. Don't get too comfortable with what you know. There's always more to learn. And if you're not constantly pushing yourself to be better, you'll be left behind." The recruits stood straighter, their expressions now a mixture of determination and anticipation. They knew they had much to learn, but for the first time, they were ready to take the next step, to embrace the lessons James had shown them, lessons of patience, wisdom, and the quiet strength that comes with experience. The days that followed felt different. The recruits were more focused, their movements deliberate as they went through their training routines. The chatter had quieted down, replaced by the hum of concentration. James Hawk Cooper had shown them more than just how to shoot, he had shown them how to think, how to observe, and most importantly, how to wait. The field felt different now, less like a place to prove themselves and more like a place to learn. The wind, the sun, the distance, all these things mattered in ways the recruits had never considered before. Ethan Moore, who had once been so sure of himself, found himself lost in thought more often than not. he caught himself watching James more than focusing on his own training. Olivia Price, too, had changed. The quiet reserve she had once held had transformed into a kind of determined focus. She no longer just followed the drills, she adapted them, finding ways to improve herself with every movement. Jacob Lewis had started asking questions, thoughtful ones, about tactics and timing, showing the curiosity he had once lacked. Mia Clark, who had been the most skeptical, now carried herself with a new sense of purpose. Even Logan Hall, the one who had been the most eager to challenge James from the start, now found himself paying closer attention, not to prove something, but to understand the lessons that had been shared with him. One morning, as they gathered for another round of training, James stood at the edge of the field, watching the recruits with a critical eye. They had grown since that first day, but there was still more to be done. Ethan, feeling the weight of his newfound understanding, approached James. "What's next?" he asked, his voice steady, but with a hint of respect. James turned to him, his eyes narrowing slightly as if weighing the question. "Next, you learn to see beyond the target," he said. "It's not just about hitting something at a distance. It's about understanding everything around you. The terrain, the wind, the way the light hits the target. You've learned how to wait, but now you need to learn how to read the world." The recruits stood together, listening intently. They had come to understand that this wasn't just about physical skill, it was about mental acuity, about seeing the unseen and feeling the subtle shifts in the world around them. "So, you mean, we have to be aware of everything?" Olivia asked, her voice quiet but certain. James nodded. "Exactly. The best soldiers aren't just those who can hit the mark. They're the ones who can anticipate the next move, the ones who know the environment better than anyone else." Ethan stepped back, looking over the field as if seeing it for the first time. He had been so focused on his own performance, but now, he understood that true mastery came from understanding the bigger picture. "And how do we get there?" he asked. James gave a small smile. "You keep going. You keep learning. And most importantly, you keep paying attention. The moment you stop watching, stop listening, that's when you miss the lesson." The recruits stood taller now, each of them feeling the weight of those words. They weren't just learning how to be soldiers anymore. They were learning how to be masters of their craft, how to see the world in ways they had never imagined before. And as they moved through the drills that day, they did so with a new sense of purpose. James Hawk Cooper had given them something more than just lessons. He had given them a new way of thinking, a new way of being. And for the first time, they understood that the journey was just beginning. The recruits had become more than just a group of soldiers in training. They had grown into a cohesive unit, each of them moving with purpose and intention. The drills had become less about proving their individual skills and more about honing their collective understanding of the world around them. James Hawk Cooper had watched them silently, observing their progress without speaking. But today, he had a new challenge for them. The sun was high in the sky, and the air was thick with the anticipation of the day's task. James gathered the recruits together, his eyes scanning their faces as they stood in front of him. "Today," he began, his voice calm but firm, "I'm going to test you in ways you haven't been tested before. We're going beyond the basics now. You've learned patience, you've learned to wait for the right moment. But today, you will learn how to trust your instincts." Ethan Moore, now more reserved and thoughtful, stepped forward, his expression serious. "How do we do that?" he asked. James looked at him, his gaze unwavering. "By learning to listen to the world around you. You can't always rely on what you see or what you know. Sometimes, it's about feeling the right moment, sensing when something is off. And that's what I'm going to push you to do today." The recruits exchanged glances, the challenge set before them a step into uncharted territory. Olivia Price, the most introspective of the group, spoke up. "You mean we have to trust our gut?" James nodded. "Exactly. But trust doesn't come easy. It comes from experience, from paying attention to the smallest details. It's in the wind, in the way the light changes, in the subtle movements around you. Trusting your instincts is about knowing when to act without second-guessing yourself." The recruit stood in silence, absorbing his words. Each of them had grown in their own way, but now, they were about to take a step beyond what they thought they were capable of. "You'll be doing something different today," James continued, breaking the quiet. "I want each of you to navigate the terrain, but not with the usual methods. No maps, no compass. Only your instincts." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, unsure of what that would entail. "No maps?" he asked. James shook his head. "No maps. No tools. Just you and the environment. Use everything around you to find your way. The terrain will challenge you, the weather will shift, but your instincts will guide you." The recruits looked at each other, uncertainty creeping in. But deep down, they knew that this was what they had been preparing for. James stepped back, allowing them to process the task. "You have 1 hour," he said. "And remember, this isn't about speed. It's about awareness. Trust what you feel, not just what you see." As the recruits began to move out, there was an unspoken tension in the air. They were entering new territory, not just physically but mentally. Each step felt different, the ground beneath them unfamiliar without the safety net of tools and gadgets. They moved through the terrain with caution, each of them learning to read the subtle signs in the world around them. Ethan noticed the way the shadows shifted, how the wind changed direction as they moved, the subtle incline of the ground beneath his feet. Olivia kept her eyes on the way the leaves rustled, noting the way the breeze pushed against them. Jacob felt the temperature drop slightly, a sign that the weather was about to change. Mia, usually quick to act, found herself slowing down, sensing that rushing would only lead her off course. Logan, who had been the most skeptical at first, now moved with purpose, trusting his instincts to guide him forward. Time seemed to slow as they navigated the path, the pressure of the task weighing on them. They had no map, no compass, only their senses to guide them. When the hour was up, they gathered at the designated point, each of them feeling the weight of what they had just accomplished. James stood waiting, his expression unreadable as he surveyed the group. "So," he said finally, his voice steady, "how did it feel?" Ethan was the first to speak. "It was harder than I thought," he admitted, his voice reflective. "I kept waiting for something to tell me I was going the right way, but I had to trust myself." Olivia nodded. "It was like I had to listen to everything around me," she said. "Not just look at the path, but feel it, sense it." James smiled faintly. "Exactly. This is what it means to trust your instincts. You've all taken the first step. Now, it's time to keep moving forward. You've learned to listen to the world. The next step is learning to listen to yourselves." The recruit stood a little taller, the weight of his words settling in. They hadn't just learned how to navigate the land, they had learned how to trust their own judgment, their own abilities. And for the first time, they truly understood the depth of what James had been teaching them. They were no longer just soldiers in training. They were becoming something more, aware, thoughtful, and ready to face whatever came next. The next morning, as the recruits lined up for their usual training, there was an unspoken shift in the air. The lesson from the day before had settled into each of them, and they moved with more intent, their eyes sharper, their steps more focused. James Hawk Cooper stood at the front, watching them with a quiet, assessing gaze. The challenge of navigating by instinct had pushed them further than they expected, and now, they were ready for something more. Ethan Moore, still feeling the weight of the previous day's lesson, found himself thinking more deeply about every movement. He was no longer just going through the motions. He was actively learning, testing himself, finding out what he was truly capable of. Olivia Price, who had always been introspective, now carried herself with a calm confidence. She no longer hesitated when making decisions, trusting herself more than she ever had before. Jacob Lewis, once quick to question everything, had begun to embrace the idea of patience. His actions were deliberate, each one measured and purposeful. Mia Clark, who had been the most skeptical, was now more engaged than ever. She no longer doubted James' methods, she trusted them. And Logan Hall, always the one to challenge authority, had come to realize that sometimes the best way forward was to listen and learn rather than to push against what seemed unfamiliar. James stepped forward, his eyes scanning the group. He was silent for a moment, letting the weight of the past few days settle on them. "Today," he said finally, his voice low and steady, "we're going to test how well you've learned to trust yourselves. But this time, you're going to rely on each other. You've been learning to trust your instincts, but now, you're going to learn to trust the people around you." The recruits exchanged glances, uncertainty flickering in their eyes. Ethan, who had come to respect James' teachings, spoke up. "What do you mean? We're not alone anymore." James met his gaze and nodded. "Exactly. The battlefield doesn't care about your individual skills. It cares about how well you work together. You'll be tested as a unit today. This isn't about one of you succeeding. This is about all of you succeeding together." Olivia stepped forward, her voice steady. "How do we do that?" James pointed to a series of obstacles ahead of them, ropes to climb, walls to scale, a muddy field to cross. "You'll face these challenges as a team. The only way to get through is by working together. You'll need to communicate, support one another, and make sure no one is left behind. If one of you falls behind, the whole group fails." Ethan looked at the obstacles, then back at his team. "We've trained as individuals, but now it's about us as a group," he said, more to himself than anyone else. James gave a small nod. "Exactly. But remember, this is not about brute force. It's about thinking, about strategy, about being able to adapt quickly. Work together, trust each other, and you'll succeed." The recruits nodded, and without another word, they began the course. They tackled the first obstacle as a group, coordinating their movements, pulling each other up the ropes, helping one another over the walls. There were moments of hesitation, moments when they stumbled, but they didn't falter for long. They quickly learned to communicate, to pass information between one another, to support each other's weaknesses and amplify their strengths. Olivia, once the quiet one, found herself leading a part of the group, guiding them through a particularly tricky section. Jacob, who had often been unsure of himself, took the initiative to help Mia navigate a steep incline. Ethan and Logan worked together, strategizing on how to approach the final obstacle. Every step of the way, they learned more about each other, about what it meant to rely on someone else's instincts as much as their own. When they finally crossed the last part of the course, they stood together, breathless and covered in mud, but there was no doubt in their eyes. They had done it, and they had done it as a team. James watched them quietly from a distance, a faint smile crossing his face. He had seen what he needed to see. They had learned the most important lesson of all, that true strength comes from unity, from understanding that each person's abilities complement the others. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were a team, one that trusted each other, one that knew how to adapt, and one that was ready to face whatever came next. As the days passed, the recruits felt a new energy surging within them. They had learned to trust themselves and each other, but the lessons weren't over. James Hawk Cooper knew that the real test for these recruits was not just about physical endurance or mental strength, it was about how they would handle the unknown. Today, the challenge would be different. There would be no course, no defined obstacles. Today, they would be put to the test in a way that none of them had expected. The recruits gathered at the training ground, their faces a mix of determination and curiosity. James stood before them, his posture straight, his eyes scanning the group. "Today, we step into the unknown," he said. "You've learned how to trust your instincts, how to rely on each other, but now, you'll learn how to handle what you can't predict." Ethan Moore, his once arrogant attitude replaced by quiet confidence, stepped forward. "What do you mean by that?" he asked, his voice steady. James didn't answer immediately. Instead, he gestured toward the horizon, where a thick fog had begun to settle over the training ground. "You'll navigate that," he said. "Without any guidance. No maps, no compass, no training. Just you, your team, and your instincts." The recruits exchanged nervous glances. The idea of facing the unknown was different from anything they had done before. It wasn't a challenge they could prepare for. Olivia Price, always the calm one, spoke up. "How do we know where to go?" James gave a small smile. "You won't. You'll have to find your way. You'll rely on each other's instincts, on your ability to read the environment, and on your trust in yourselves. The path will reveal itself as you go." Jacob Lewis, who had become more thoughtful with each passing day, raised his hand. "What if we get lost?" James' eyes softened slightly. "Then you learn. The only failure here is not trying. Keep moving forward, and you'll find your way." With that, James stepped aside, leaving the recruits to face the fog that now covered the entire field. The air was thick, and the ground beneath their boots felt uncertain, as if they were walking on unfamiliar terrain. Ethan took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. "All right," he said, turning to the group. "We do this together. We rely on each other." Olivia nodded, her face determined. "We're a team. Let's move." With that, they stepped forward, walking into the fog. The world around them seemed to disappear as they moved through the thick mist. They couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and every step felt like it could lead them into the unknown. But as they moved, they found their rhythm, relying on the small signs they could read, slight changes in the wind, the sound of footsteps, the subtle incline of the ground. They communicated silently, using gestures and body language, guiding each other through the fog. Jacob, who had learned to trust his instincts, took the lead for a while, sensing a slight shift in the wind that seemed to indicate a change in direction. Mia Clark, once the most skeptical of the group, had become more attuned to the subtle cues in the environment. She noticed the way the fog parted slightly, a hint of sunlight breaking through the mist. "This way," she whispered, pointing toward the direction where the light seemed to be. The group followed her lead, trusting her instincts. Logan Hall, who had been the most hesitant at first, now moved with a quiet confidence. He wasn't trying to prove anything anymore, he was simply focused on the task at hand. Together, they navigated the fog, slowly but surely, relying on their instincts and the bond they had built as a team. Hours passed, though none of them could say exactly how much time had gone by. The fog began to lift, and as it cleared, they found themselves at the edge of a familiar training area. They had made it. Without maps, without guidance, they had navigated the unknown together. James stood at the edge of the field, watching them approach. His face remained calm, but there was a glimmer of pride in his eyes. "You made it," he said quietly. "You didn't know where you were going, but you trusted yourselves, and that's what got you here. That's the lesson. In life, and in combat, you won't always have a clear path. But if you trust your instincts, rely on your team, and keep moving forward, you'll find your way." The recruits stood there, panting and exhausted, but their faces were filled with a new understanding. They had faced the unknown, and they had done it together. And for the first time, they truly understood what it meant to trust, not just in themselves, but in each other. The weeks that followed were a turning point for the recruits. Each day brought a new challenge, but their training had taken on a deeper meaning. They no longer focused solely on physical strength or speed. Now, they approached every task with a mindset of strategy, patience, and teamwork. James Hawk Cooper had taught them how to trust themselves, but more importantly, he had shown them how to trust one another. The last lesson they had faced, navigating the unknown together, had opened their eyes to what true cohesion meant. They were no longer individuals working side by side, they were a unit. A team. And now, as they stood before James for their final challenge, there was no hesitation in their eyes. They were ready. "Today," James began, his voice steady, "you're going to put everything you've learned to the test. Everything you've worked for so far, your patience, your instincts, your teamwork, it all comes down to this." The recruits exchanged quiet glances, knowing that the challenge ahead would push them further than anything they had done before. "You've spent weeks building trust," James continued, his gaze sweeping over them. "Now, I want to see how well you can rely on each other in a real-world scenario. You're going to have to make decisions quickly, adapt to changing situations, and above all, you'll need to communicate with each other without hesitation. Ethan Moore, who had once been the most self-assured, now stood taller than before, his body language exuding a calm confidence. "What's the mission?" he asked, his voice no longer uncertain but firm. James smiled slightly, a hint of pride in his eyes. "Your mission is simple," he said. "You'll have to navigate through an obstacle course that will test every skill you've learned. But here's the catch, you won't know the obstacles in advance. You'll have to work together to figure them out and overcome them as a team." Olivia Price, who had grown into a natural leader, nodded thoughtfully. "So, it's about adaptability," she said. "Not just following a set plan, but adjusting to what comes next." James nodded. "Exactly. In the field, things rarely go as planned. You have to be able to think on your feet, make quick decisions, and trust that your team has your back." The recruits gathered their gear, each of them mentally preparing for the unknown. They knew that this would be the culmination of everything they had learned. As they entered the course, they immediately encountered the first obstacle, a wall they had to climb. It wasn't part of the usual training. It was taller than anything they had faced before, and it required everyone to work together to get over it. Ethan and Logan Hall took the lead, coordinating their movements, while Olivia and Jacob Lewis provided the support from below, helping the others up. The teamwork was seamless, the communication effortless. They moved as one, just as James had taught them. The second obstacle was a series of ropes suspended above a muddy pit. As they approached, Mia Clark, who had once doubted herself, stepped forward without hesitation. "I'll go first," she said, her voice steady. "I'll guide you through." She moved quickly, her movements precise, helping the others across. No one second-guessed her decision. They trusted her instincts. As the course continued, the obstacles grew more unpredictable. Some required physical strength, others required quick thinking, but through each challenge, the recruits relied on one another. No one hesitated. No one faltered. By the time they reached the final obstacle, a narrow ledge they had to cross with nothing but a rope for balance, they were exhausted, but they were united. James watched them from a distance, his eyes sharp as ever. The recruits had come a long way since that first day. They had learned to rely on their own abilities, but more importantly, they had learned to rely on each other. When they finally crossed the last challenge, they stood together, breathless but triumphant. James approached them, his expression unreadable as always. "You did it," he said quietly. "You've learned everything I've taught you. But remember, this is just the beginning. You're not done yet. The real world is full of challenges you can't predict, obstacles you can't foresee. But if you keep trusting yourselves and each other, you'll be ready for anything." The recruits stood taller than they ever had before. They had come together as a team, and they were no longer just individuals, they were a unit, ready for whatever the world might throw their way.